Canada has a lot of geopolitical advantages. It has a free trade agreement with the world's largest economy and two enormous moats on its eastern and western borders, the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. So what's the problem? Well, Canada's dwindling population, expensive cost of living, and questionable leadership indicate their current political system is tearing the country apart. And the ramifications for the chaos that this will unleash will affect the entire Western Hemisphere. The United States and Canada are intensely similar. Canadians influence culture through Hollywood, eat many of the same foods, and are members of multiple American alliance networks. But this leads to a relatively unclear cultural identity. In other videos, I've called Canada America's hat, and they'd like to differentiate themselves from both the Brits and the Yanks if they could, but the way they do that is somewhat incoherent. Internationally, they're understood as the left-leaning version of America, with universal healthcare, robust social safety nets, and liberal immigration policies. That is not a facade. You could also say that they're doing an imitation of European politics, just on a different continent. But that's a generalization that oversimplifies an enormous landmass. While the vast majority of Canadians live near the southern border, they are still spread out across a great distance. To the east, you've got French-speaking Quebec with a very distinct identity. Then you have the other eastern provinces, the most consequential being Ontario, with the biggest city, Toronto, and the capital, Ottawa. They share a lot of qualities with other left-leaning East Coast cities like Boston and New York. Both of those groups are separated from the West by the Canadian Shield, a huge plateau that's good for mining and terrible for building cities. You have to go further west than Denver to find another city with a population over 1 million Canadians. That's a sharp contrast to the US Midwest, with major metros like Chicago serving as cultural midpoints. Canada's center is rightward leaning and the location of most of the country's oil and gas industry. That extends over the Rockies until you get to Vancouver, which is in the same West Coast vein as Oregon and Washington, but with even more migration from Asia. Sprinkled across all this and extending into the north are native indigenous communities who have far more latitude and sovereignty than anything you see in the United States. This is still a sweeping generalization with imperfect metaphors, but hopefully you can see how Canada's geography reinforces major cultural differences. Tying it all together is one point that I cannot underemphasize. Canada is a confederacy. That means a relatively weaker central government wrangling a diverse set of provinces. Their Westminster-style parliamentary system of government attempts to control for these differences, similar to what you see in India. But it's worth acknowledging that other countries with distinct, cloistered ethnic groups have much higher rates of internal conflict. Ethiopia and Burma have very different histories and governance structures, but they've both seen these types of internal tensions erupt into conflict. To avoid the fate of these countries, Canada is attempting to craft a postmodern national identity. That means a fluid, pluralistic, multicultural nation without tight relationship to its English and French roots. The jury is still out as to whether this can be effective long term, but the fate of the Confederation depends on it. Canada is endowed with loads of natural resources, which plays a significant role in the country's economy. As the fourth largest oil producer and the third largest natural gas producer globally, 10% of the economy is just the energy sector, with 80% of that coming from one province, Alberta. The USMCA and geography means that Canada exports substantial amounts of these resources to the United States. But Canadian policymakers see this as a somewhat precarious situation, and not just because of green energy initiatives. Canada's oil sands, also known as tar sands, are among the most expensive sources of oil production in the world. It is complex to extract and process, which means that the break-even price for Canadian oil, the price where producing it is profitable, is in the neighborhood of $50 per barrel. Meanwhile, in places like Saudi Arabia, the break-even price is estimated to be as low as $3 to $5 per barrel. Their low production cost enables the Saudis to remain profitable even when global oil prices are relatively low. But Canada would feel the pain first if global oil consumption were to go down and prices were to fall. That could happen in the case of a green energy transition or just a substantial global economic recession. And that would have a domino effect on the rest of Canada's economy. 20 years ago, Canada was staring down the same demographic crisis that the Japanese and the Germans were facing. As we've discussed in past videos, the Germans let in a few immigrants, and the Japanese largely shut themselves off from outsiders. Canada went in the opposite direction. They opened themselves up to more than 4 million migrants. These were young folks who were ready to work, contribute to the tax base, and stabilize Canada's generous welfare system. But Canada had less than half the population of Germany. Every Canadian citizen would fit into Japan's largest city, Tokyo. When you add a bunch of people to just a few major metropolitan areas without building the requisite housing, you create a new problem. With limited supply, Canada's housing market has become increasingly unaffordable, particularly in urban centers like Toronto and Vancouver. The housing crisis is a significant challenge for the country, with far-reaching social and economic consequences. Restrictive zoning laws and NIMBY regulations have limited the construction of new housing in these high-demand areas. The result has been a rapid increase in home prices and rents, making it difficult for many Canadians, especially younger generations, to afford housing and start families. The average home price in Canada has risen by over 50% in the last 5 years, far outpacing income growth. Vancouver is the second least affordable city in the world, and Toronto ranks 11th. That's calculated by dividing a city's median house price with its median household income. For comparison, Vancouver is more than twice as bad as New York City and London. As we outlined in our video on China's economy, the housing bubble is a serious issue for any country, but it is a particular risk to political stability. As younger generations spend more of their budget on housing, their personal balance sheet carries greater risk. The average Canadian household carries approximately $197,000 of debt. That's 183% of disposable income, one of the highest ratios among any developed country. This means that it's both very hard to grow out of their economic problems, and a downturn is especially dangerous. Since Canada's economy remains heavily reliant on natural resources, a global recession could trigger escalating shocks throughout their financial system. A drop in oil prices would lower GDP and lead to a housing market crash. It took decades for Japan to overcome their real estate crisis, and Canada's might be worse. And the data indicates that Main Street Canadians are already hurting. Bankruptcies are up, and the economy isn't creating enough jobs, which means that mortgage payments will be missed. And we haven't even touched on the issues in the Canadian stock market. Canadian Securities Administrators is far more lax in its regulation of financial markets. Influencers can pump penny stocks, pretend weed companies can go public and screw retail investors. Kevin O'Leary has been able to operate there for decades. What more can I say? In February of 2022, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau took an unprecedented step that sent shockwaves through Canadian society. In response to the Freedom Convoy protests against vaccine mandates and lockdowns, Trudeau invoked the Emergencies Act, granting himself sweeping powers to silence the demonstrations.
The small fringe minority of people who are on their way to Ottawa or who are holding unacceptable views that they're expressing do not represent the views of Canadians who have been there for each other.
The move was particularly controversial due to the financial measures entailed. As reported by Bloomberg, banks and financial institutions will be required to review their relationships with anyone involved in an illegal blockade and report them. They'll have the authority to stop providing services to those suspected of using their accounts to help the protesters and to freeze accounts without getting a court order. The government also broadened its anti-money laundering rules to cover crowdfunding sites like GoFundMe, which had been used to donate to the protesters. By granting himself the power to freeze citizens' banking privileges without judicial oversight, based solely on one politician's vague definition of involvement, Trudeau crossed a dangerous line. In the modern economy, the currency used to transact is increasingly digital. This creates a system where every citizen is tied to their money, granting the state the power to decide whether a citizen is allowed to participate in modern society. In this context, money no longer represents stored wealth that can be freely exchanged for goods and services. Instead, it represents wealth that can only be exchanged with the state's permission. The rights, freedoms, and assets of Canadian citizens are supposed to be protected by the Canadian Bill of Rights. But Trudeau's position seems to be that that only applies to those who share his political ideology.
There's a level of admiration I actually have for China. Basic dictatorship is allowing them to actually turn their economy around on a dime.
Now, this part will be obvious to all the Canadians watching, but Justin Trudeau is a Nepo baby. As the privileged son of a former prime minister, he learned to wield power at a young age from his father. If you don't think that the rules apply to you, then it's easy to abuse power. One of Trudeau's most significant scandals involved the Montreal-based engineering firm SNC-Lavalin. In 2019, it was alleged that Trudeau and his office had pressured then Attorney General Jody Wilson-Raybould to intervene in a criminal case against SNC-Lavalin, which was facing corruption charges. Wilson-Raybould refused and was later demoted and ultimately resigned from the cabinet. After a 6-month-long investigation, the Canadian Ethics Commissioner concluded that Trudeau had violated Section 9 of the Federal Conflict of Interest Act. Another major scandal involved the We Charity, which had close ties to the Trudeau family. In 2020, the government awarded a $900 million contract to We Charity to administer a student grant program, despite the organization's lack of experience with such programs. It was later revealed that Trudeau's mother and brother had been paid for speaking engagements by the charity. Trudeau apologized for not recusing himself from the decision-making process, but is still in power years later. While Canadians will often view American politics with contempt and disgust over the election of our Nepo baby, Donald Trump, we should view Trudeau the exact same way. It's not hard to understand what is fueling anti-establishment sentiment, unless you're the current prime minister. The only difficult thing to figure out is what happens next. Well, Canadian leadership thinks that more taxes will do the trick, but that's highly unlikely to translate into sustainable economic growth. The government can't even turn those tax dollars into better healthcare. The government also has to spend that money to keep Quebec within the Canadian system. In the 1960s, 1980s, and 1990s, the province's independence movement came close to successfully breaking away. While these narrowly failed, they demonstrated the strong, sustainable separatist sentiment. The province exerts significant control over its own immigration and tax collection. Critically, Quebec receives around $13 billion annually in equalization payments from the federal government, essentially an incentive to remain part of Canada. The province will continue to use the threat of another independence referendum as leverage, with Quebec's current premier, François Legault, being elected for his French nationalist stance. How do you think that makes central Canada feel? On the other side of the Canadian shield, provinces like Alberta are footing the bill for a government that does not align with their values or interests. Will there be civil war? No, these are still Canadians. But the Confederation was not built to force these provinces together. If Canada cannot digest a multicultural, postmodern identity, then the same is likely true for other countries. The United States should be watching these developments very closely as it considers its policies for housing, immigration, and civic identity. Let me know what you think in the comments, and check out the next video where I ranked US allies in a tier list.